Hello, builders of good. Thank you for tuning in to the Build Good Fundraising podcast. Fundraising isn't easy, but it should be simple. So, on this show, we take the mystery out of raising money. Now, on every episode, we coach you how to build your fundraising like a flywheel. The flywheel has 5 steps. Number 1 is listening to donors. Number 2 is engaging them. Number 3 is asking the right people for the right things. Number 4 is celebrating every gift at every level. Number 5 is reporting back in a real-time and responsive way. If you master the 5 parts of the flywheel, your fundraising flywheel will start to spin reliably with less effort on your part. Your revenue will grow, and so will your career as a fundraiser. Now, every week we focus on one part of the flywheel. And today we are focusing on asking. And in fact, we are going to focus on asking for the next few episodes because we're beginning a series on new donor acquisition. And today is a solo pod. You're flying solo with me. We've got no guests today. It's you and I hanging out, kicking off this series on acquisition. I wanted to have this chat with you before we talk about acquisition because I wanted to frame it in the right way, and that is how to think about acquisition. So before we get into 4 core ways you can acquire new donors today, I do first want to talk about retention and why acquisition is important, but also why it's just part of the game of growing your revenue. Now, almost every fundraiser that I talk to, almost every organization that comes to Build Good for help with their fundraising, they want to talk acquisition. They want to figure out how can we acquire new donors. We need new donors. We feel like we just need new donors. We need more people to hear about our mission so we can grow. We need more people to understand why what we do matters so much and what's at stake here. And that is a very real pain point for many of you. I know it's oftentimes a very real pain point, specifically for like smaller shops who don't actually have a donor base of thousands of donors and who might already feel like they're sort of at capacity with the current donors that they have, whether that's a false belief or not. So real pain point, we are going to get into that, and I do want to help you figure out how to acquire new donors. Before we get into 4 ways to acquire new donors, if you've been listening to this show for any amount of time, you likely know that we are first and foremost really big advocates of retention. Like engaging the donors you already have, listening to them, asking the right people for the right things, reporting back, celebrating every gift, like the flywheel stuff, that is about building a community of people who feel like they're an important part of your team. That is a retention play. That is inspiring people enough, keeping them connected enough, showing up to serve them enough so that they will eventually maybe even leave a gift in their will and even like stake their reputation on your cause because they said, hey, once I'm gone, once I pass away, this matters to me so much that I want to make sure it's preserved with a gift in my will, and I'm okay with my name being attached to that for the rest of time. Now, the reason that we emphasize retention so much is that even if you're in a position where you think like, hey, I think we're at capacity with our current donor base, there's a chance that the $50 donor in your database might be a $5,000 or $50,000 or $500,000 donor in another database. Oftentimes, donors are maybe not giving us their best gift yet. Not their best gift as in the best gift period. I mean, like the best gift for our organization, the best gift that they think that they want to give to our organization. They may have other organizations they care more about, or they may have other organizations they want to give more money to. That's great. That's fine. I don't think we're in competition. I don't think if somebody's giving 50,000 over here and $50 over here, that you should be like, we want that 50,000 to come to us. No, I just think that you should work with your donors as much as possible to lead them to a place where they can give the best gift possible for your organization. And oftentimes for many of our donors, we're just not quite there yet. And oftentimes that is because uh, they maybe don't feel like they're an important part of the team. Maybe we haven't done a good job bringing them along. Maybe we haven't done a good job with cultivation and stewardship. Oftentimes, we haven't done a good job of listening and engaging. Maybe we have been treating them like a donor in the mass file when we should have maybe taken them out for coffee and advanced the relationship to a more one-on-one sort of a situation. All sorts of reasons. So oftentimes the flywheel is about that. It's the work of retaining your donors. It's the work already in front of you. The donors already in front of you, leading them toward giving more frequently or giving more often or making larger gifts. And then over time, becoming mid-level donors, monthly donors, and ultimately, hopefully, legacy donors. The legacy gift is the largest gift any donor might ever make to your organization. And that might be a $5,000 gift. It might be a $30,000 gift. It might be $1 million gift. But every single donor in your file, whether they are mass, mid, major, whatever language you use to qualify donors in your file, every single human in your CRM, every single human in your CRM has the potential to leave a legacy gift. Every single human in your CRM, every single donor that made the gift to you has the ability to leave a gift in their will to your organization. And I want you to play the long game. And I want you to internally say, that's what we're here for. First time giver to legacy leaver. That's the kind of relationship that we are interested in. Fundraisers often talk about, oh, fundraising is all about relationships. It's just all about relationships. Well, think about the relationships in your life. The best relationships in your life are complicated, they're messy. The ones that last a long time, sometimes you are closer, sometimes you feel further away. Sometimes you're not in touch for a while, but you don't give up and play a long game. And, like look at successful marriages that last 10, 20, 30 years. They require a ton of work. Anybody that's been married for a long time, anybody who's been in a relationship for a long time will tell you relationships require a lot of work. You have to intentionally show up all the time. You have to put in a lot of work. It takes a lot of work, but it's worth it. So that's why we're so big on retention. I don't want you to be on a new donor acquisition hamster wheel. Some very big organizations, if I said the name, you would know who they are. Some very big brands. They are on a new donor acquisition hamster wheel. They are so addicted to mass direct marketing that gets low dollar gifts, low frequency gifts per donor, but that is just profitable enough that they can't stop. I talked to an organization just yesterday. They are mailing out between 400 to 600,000 pieces of mail per month. And a good amount of that is acquisition, low average gift, very low frequency sort of giving per donor, ekes out enough profit that it's hard to stop. And it's all based on direct marketing sort of acquisition and not that much focus on cultivation and retention. Now, retention not only makes a ton of sense because of the thing you and I just talked about, which is like if we invest in a long term relationship with a donor and we care more about being connected over the long term than a short term gift, that we might get a lot of gifts and wills. That's important, yes. But also, retention is actually easier and cheaper. Donors that you already have are actually a lot more valuable than the ones you hope to acquire. They are way more likely to become monthly givers. They're way more likely to become mid level givers. They're way more likely to renew year after year, and they're way more likely to become major donors. And yes, they are more likely to leave a gift in their will. So retention is easier, cheaper. It is a good business decision. It's also a good human decision in terms of it's the right thing to do. The people that already gave you a gift, that already raised their hand and they said, hey, I want to help, spending more time with them is the right thing to do. Now, that doesn't mean you should stop acquiring new donors. It doesn't mean you shouldn't acquire new donors. And in fact, oftentimes one of our recommendations is you are way behind on your new donor acquisition. We need to invest in new donor acquisition. I'm just trying to say, before you acquire new donors, you need to make sure that your retention strategy is in place. Before you spend money acquiring new donors, which is expensive, by the way, acquiring new donors is expensive. It takes money. It's not expensive in the long term. It pays dividends. In the short term, though, it feels expensive. Now, before you go and spend that money, make sure you have a flywheel spinning. Make sure your retention strategy is in place, your cultivation and your stewardship strategy is in place. Because you do need to balance stewardship and cultivation and retention with new donor acquisition. You have to. Here's what happens if you don't acquire new donors. Here's what happens if you only focus on the donors you already have. You might see growth. Well, you very likely will see growth in your file for a year or two or even three. You might even get a lot more profitable in terms of cost per dollar raised because you are no longer spending money on new donor acquisition. So that's off the profit and loss statement. And like we talked about, retention is cheaper. You are very likely going to have lower costs in terms of your donor communications, in terms of mailouts, in terms of everything else. You may have lower costs and you might have more net revenue in the bank account. And you might do that for 1, 2, or 3 years. But donor attrition is completely normal. You can't not have donors leave your file because people change, people die. A lot of people, it's not natural behavior to give year after year after year. So you will always have some attrition. And so naturally, if you don't acquire new donors, you are going to have fewer people give year after year. And if you only focus on donor retention, you might not notice that you have a problem. Why? Because your donor retention rate might actually go up. You may have fewer people give year after year. Your net income might go up, and you might have a giant problem in your file that you might not even be noticing. So how does that work? Well, let's say you start with 1,000 donors. You've got 1,000 donors, and let's say your overall retention rate. So we're not going retention rate by new donor, by lapsed donor, just like your overall retention rate on that file of 1,000 donors is 50%. You would be kind of average. Okay, so 50% of donors don't renew. That means the next year you have 500 donors. And that's when you go, I think we've got a problem. We had 1,000 donors last year. We have 500 donors this year. Let's really work on retention. So let's say year two, your retention remains at 50% while you're spinning up a flywheel, right? Maybe you caught it a little bit late. You're down to 250 donors. Now your efforts are starting to pay off though, and your donor retention rate goes up to 70%. So next year you have 175 donors. Let's say you maintain your stewardship efforts at 70%. That's a really good retention rate. Now you've got 122 people. Now, let's say you really crank it up and you go to like 80 or 85% retention rate. Now you've got 100 people. In a span of 5-ish years, you've gone from 1,000 donors to 100 donors. Now, those 100 donors may have increased their giving along the way, but by the time you realize, oof, we only have 100 donors, we've lost 900 donors. Our file shrunk like 90%. We're down 100 people. At that point, it's too late. At that point, it might be too late because it's going to take you way more than 5 years to reinvest enough money to get back to where you were. Now, I'm not saying this to scare you, and I'm being a little bit dramatic with the numbers here. It's just to prove a point, though, is that if you don't do something about donor retention and you don't do something about bringing in new donors into the fold to make up for donor attrition, then at some point, when it's almost too late, by the time the alarms go off, you might be behind a few years. And it's going to take years to spin that back up, to get a new donor acquisition program working and spinning back up. So I suggest that whatever you do, don't stop new donor acquisition. I think you should have a huge focus on existing donors and retention. I think you should have a huge focus on reviving your file from your existing donors. Huge. But I don't think that you should stop new donor acquisition. Always be acquiring. Don't put all your eggs into acquisition. Don't be on an acquisition hamster wheel, but always be acquiring. That's number one. Whatever you do, don't stop new donor acquisition. Always be acquiring. Number two, and this is the thing to like tattoo on the inside of your brain. If you take one thing away from today's podcast, from this chat that you and I are having, the one thing I want you to take away is this: retention begins at acquisition. Always be acquiring, yes, but always be retaining. Retention begins at acquisition. Retention is easier, it is cheaper, it is the best thing you could do to increase short term, medium term, and long term value of your donor base. One of the best ways to grow your income and your revenue is to acquire new donors and retain them. Just acquiring new donors is an imperfect solution. Acquire new donors and retain as many of them as possible. Don't try to fix a retention problem with more acquisition. It's not going to work. You're just going to have this leaky bucket that you're just going to keep losing donors out the back door, and you're going to be desperate to get new donors in the front door. So don't fix a retention problem with acquisition. You want to spin up that flywheel of donor retention, and then you want to bring new donors into it because more of them will stay. And by the way, if you do a great job, you actually can do less donor acquisition. And sometimes your donor acquisition can even be a little bit less effective. You can try new stuff with donor acquisition. You can fail a little bit. You can experiment. You can test and optimize. You have the cash flow to do that. Cash flow gives you confidence. Cash flow gives you oxygen. You get to breathe. You get to try new stuff. You get to not only like survive from budget to budget season, but actually like try new stuff and thrive. All that stuff, almost all of your fundraising problems get solved with cash flow. And the best thing you can do for cash flow is retention. So get that in place, fix retention, and then invest in new donor acquisition. That's how you get meaningful growth. So now that we've got that sorted, let's get into the 4 ways that you can actually acquire new donors. And I'm going to call this the core 4. I am borrowing this concept from Alex Hormozi and applying it to fundraising. So if you're wondering where this comes from, this is from a dude called Alex Hormozi. I didn't make this up. I'm just applying it to fundraising. So here's the core 4, and I want you to visualize this. We are going to draw a table in our minds, and the table has 2 columns, and then it's got 2 rows. All right, can you picture that? You've got 2 columns side by side, and then each column has 2 rows going across. Can you picture that? So you've basically got this table like an Excel table, and it's got 4 cells or 4 boxes in your table. Now, the column on the left, that is going to be people who know you. So going down the column on the left, it's going to be people who know you. Now, the column on the right, going down the column on the right, that is going to be people who don't know you. Okay, that's easy enough. People who know you, people who don't know you. Okay, now let's complete this matrix, this 4-box matrix. Now, the top row going across left to right, that is going to be one person to another person. So one-on-one. The top row, one-on-one, one-to-one. Now, the bottom row going left to right, that is going to be one-to-many. Right? One-to-many. One-to-one on top, one-to-many on the bottom. And then from left to right, people who know you and people who don't know you. So that's your 4-box matrix. Now let's go through each of these 4 boxes, each representing one way of acquiring new donors. Now, these are not necessarily going to be like a super specific tactic. It's just going to be a category of how you acquire new donors. And certain activities that you might choose to do to acquire new donors, they might actually fit a few of these categories, or you might use a few of these categories in conjunction with each other. Now, let's start with the cell in the top left of the matrix. And that is going to be people who know you, and the approach is going to be one on one, right? So people who know you, going to them one on one. And we call that warm outreach. Now, this is because we're talking acquisition. This is not people who are already your donors. That applies for all of these. This is just people who know you but aren't donors yet. They might be in your orbit. They might be friends of the board. They might be friends of staff. They might be volunteers. They know you, but maybe they haven't made a gift yet. Depending what kind of nonprofit you are, maybe you have like if like a free membership, or maybe like people actually use your services, who also donate. For example, if you're a healthcare nonprofit, these might be people who have used your services or who have gotten treatment at your hospital, but who aren't donors yet. But these are people who know you, right? They know who you are. They are friends or people in your orbit. They know who your organization is. When somebody from your organization like introduces themselves and says, "Hi, I'm so and so from this organization," they know exactly who the organization is. So this is warm outreach. This is going one on one to people who know you. Oftentimes, this is like personal phone calls or personal visits or sending somebody an email or inviting them to an event. Now, an event, a fundraising event, isn't necessarily one on one people who know you, but you might use this category, this warm outreach, one on one people who know you, to get somebody to come to an event, right? So that's warm outreach. That is the first core way that you can acquire new donors. Now let's move one box over to the right. And we're sticking with the one on one approach here, but now we are going to people who don't know you. They may have never heard of the organization before. And we call that cold outreach. And the only difference between warm outreach and cold outreach is that in cold outreach, you have to work a lot harder to get the meeting in the first place, to get to talk to the person. And then you obviously have to begin a relationship from scratch and introduce the organization to the person. Cold outreach is one of the hardest ways to fundraise, but it is also one of the primary ways that major gift fundraising for a lot of big shops is done. It's a lot of cold outreach, and eventually, cold outreach turns to warm outreach as the person gets to know you. So, this is prospecting for meetings, right? You might have a list of prospects that you want to get in front of, and you might send them a cold email, or you might give them a cold call, or you might even send them a postcard, handwritten postcard in the mail asking for a meeting, something like that. You might also invite them to an event, or you might ask them to sponsor an event. Now, here's the interesting part. It is while we're talking one on one of the ways that we talk about mass fundraising actually falls into one on one, and that is door to door fundraising and telefundraising, because that is one on one. It is you and that other person standing on the front stoop of their house, asking them to commit to a small gift. And you are praying and hoping that maybe they have heard of your cause, although you're assuming that they haven't. It is cold outreach. That is one of the hardest ways to fundraise: door to door fundraising and telefundraising in cold outreach. Door to door, sometimes it's called face to face fundraising. It works well in Europe. It works okay in Canada. It doesn't seem to work as well in the US. There's been lots of sort of fits and starts of outfits who have tried it. But it's still a proven way of acquiring donors, and it's often a way to acquire monthly donors, believe it or not. A lot of door to door fundraising focuses on monthly giving. And the reason it focuses on monthly giving is because conversion is so low. And so by focusing on monthly, that is a way to get more lifetime value and actually make the activity worth it. So that is cold outreach. So we've covered warm outreach and cold outreach. Now let's move down to the category of one to many. And we start on the column on the left. So now we are going to people who know you, but we're going to them one to many. So, how can we go to people who know us, who are not donors yet, but they know us, they're in our orbit? So, if they're not donors yet, we likely don't have their mailing address. So, maybe we're not sending them direct mail necessarily, like we might in stewardship and cultivation. How can we go to them? Well, this is creating content and media. This is where we're in acquisition. We're only talking about like building brand and community, going one to many using mass communication. So content and media, this can be social media, it can be thought leadership, it can be podcasts, it can be any of those things where people who are following you online, you interact with them. People who might not yet be your donor, but who know you, they know your organization, you interact with them. This might be an email newsletter that you've got going. It might be something else of value that you've created. That's going one to many to people who know you already. Now, this is often hard to measure. Building brand and in a content-led strategy is very hard to measure, but it oftentimes supports the next category, which is going to people who don't know you one to many, which is advertising. And when people see that advertising and they go and they check you out and they see that you have a lot of free content, that you have thought leadership, that can help other forms of acquisition. So let's talk about advertising. This is going to people who don't know you, and it's going in a mass market one to many. This is the area that we at Build Good often play in. So advertising, this is direct mail acquisition. This is paid ads online, like digital donor acquisition. This can be DRTV, so like broadcast TV ads, direct response television ads if you're a big shop. It can be connected TV. There is so many ways that you can advertise nowadays. And it can feel intimidating. It can also feel like it's a money suck. And that's why we may want to use some other forms of acquisition to support advertising. But this is oftentimes the most powerful way if you have a vision for meaningful and sustained growth over many years. Advertising is often the way that can help you get there faster. Now, most of the time, all of these four categories: warm outreach, cold outreach, creating content and media, and advertising, most of the time, they all work together a little bit. The times where they work together especially well is when we just look at the columns. So the column on the left and on the right. So let's look at the column on the left. The column on the left is warm outreach and creating content and media. So one often supports the other. Oftentimes, if you've been creating content and media, you have thought leadership online, you have good organic social, maybe you have a newsletter, you've got followers, people know who you are. That oftentimes is how they become people who know you. And then when you go to them one on one, warm outreach, that outreach is easier because they've already been following you online and they kind of know what you're about. Now let's look at the column on the right. This is pairing cold outreach with advertising. So remember, cold outreach is calling somebody up out of the blue and trying to get a meeting, or it is going door to door asking for a donation, or it is telefundraising. You've got a list of phone numbers that you're going to call and you're going to ask for donation right on the phone. That is cold outreach. Now, what if you've been advertising beforehand? What if people have seen your ads online? They've seen your ads on Facebook and Instagram or on LinkedIn. What if they've seen a paid post on LinkedIn by your CEO? What if they've seen your ads on connected TV or on TV? Or what if they've heard a Spotify ad from your organization? So then when you knock on their door or you end up in their email inbox or you call them up out of the blue, I'm a major donor fundraiser and I was hoping I could get 5 minutes of your attention to just have a meeting. Well, hopefully, if you've been advertising and they've seen your advertising, they would be a little bit more likely to give you a little bit more attention. So, warm outreach can work with creating content and media, and then cold outreach can work if it's supported by advertising. Of course, all four of these can help each other out in some way, shape, or form. But generally speaking, unless you're a big shop, you can't put all your focus on all four equally. Very likely, you're going to choose one or two of these and give it a good go. So that's warm outreach, cold outreach, creating content and media, and advertising. So if you can't do all four of these at once, which ones should you do? Well, it's a little bit of a matter of focus. Remember from a previous podcast episode where your attention goes, the money flows? Where you choose to put your focus and your attention and where you choose to stick with it for a while to actually give it a good go is likely going to be the area you're going to see the results out of. For example, if you did warm outreach every single day for a year, let's say you're going to do 4 calls per day. Warm outreach, people who are in your orbit but who are not donors yet. It's going to be a mix of like the board can make a list of friends, your volunteers, maybe people who've used your services. You're going to make 4 calls every day. 2 of those calls or emails um, are, are going to be like the first time you're reaching out. And then out of those 4, so every day you're going to do 4, either 4 calls or 4 emails or a mix. 2 are going to be the first time you're reaching out. The other 2 are going to be a follow-up call or a follow-up email to somebody who didn't get back to you. Now, if you do that every single day for a year, every single day for a year, just 4 emails, 4 calls per day. That's it. 2 to a like first time outreach, the other 2 following up to somebody who has not gotten back to me. You're going to be like reaching out to like, I don't know, 500 to 700 people. And even if you only get a meeting with like 10% of them, that's like 50 to 70 meetings. So that's going to pay dividends, right? So you can quickly see how this is just a matter of focus. Warm outreach, cold outreach, creating content and media and advertising. Very likely, you may have to create some sort of content and media to support all other efforts. But for warm outreach, for cold outreach, outreach, and for advertising, you're going to have to make a call for what's best for your organization on where to start with, right? Now, we are going to focus the next few episodes specifically on advertising for a few reasons. Number one, it's what, from what I can tell in talking to many of you, most of you who listen to this show, you are interested in like online donor acquisition, in direct mail acquisition, in some of those like mass market advertising ways of acquiring new donors, which makes sense because a large part of what we focus on the podcast is individual giving and annual giving and like building the most meaningful human mass sort of marketing experiences for donors. So that makes a lot of sense. Another reason why we're going to focus on that for the next few episodes, it's also one of the easiest ways that you can start with acquisition. You can start online donor acquisition with a very small budget of paid ads, and you can test your way into it. Direct mail acquisition, for example, is very, very expensive. We do it all the time. It is high stakes, it is risky, it is expensive. You really got to know what you're doing. Digital acquisition, you can spend a few $100s to get a few conversions, get a few donors, see what works, what doesn't. how to pivot, really, like how to like change the different offer, the approach. You can test your way into it. So even if you want to do mass market acquisition using direct mail, RTR TV, it's smart to start with digital to figure out what a good offer might be. So that's what we are going to focus on in the next few episodes. We're going to continue the series on new donor acquisition, focused on advertising, focused on digital new donor acquisition. And that is all for today. Thank you for hanging out with me today and just listen to me ramble on a little bit about retention and acquisition. I hope it was helpful for you. I hope you got something out of it. Here's my short action plan for you. I actually want you to get a piece of paper. I want you to draw this matrix that we talked about. Left column, people who know you. Right column, people who don't know you. Top row, going across left to right, 1 to 1. Bottom, going across left to right, bottom row, 1 to many. And so then write in your top left box, warm outreach, your top right box, cold outreach, your bottom left box, creating content and media, and your bottom right box, advertising. These are the core 4. And hang it up in your office. When you talk about new donor acquisition, this is a helpful framework for you to think about. Warm outreach, cold outreach, creating content and media, advertising. Those are the 4 options we have to acquire new donors. Now you might think, what about events? You can use the core 4 to drive people to events. That is, we're talking about categories of getting donors to engage with you. You might use events to do that, but you're going to use one of the core 4 to get people to actually come to an event. That might be warm outreach, cold outreach, by creating content and media, promoting the event, or by advertising to get people to come to the event. That's all for me today. Thank you for listening to the Build Good Fundraising podcast. If you're listening to this, you're my kind of people. I'm your kind of people. Thank you for the work you do. I'm your host, Mike Dirksen, cheering you on as you build good in the world.